Well, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight. Tonight is a good news story. Much of what we have to analyse a lot of the time is a story of difficulties for the working class movement, failure, particularly in Britain, if you think about the recent period with the general election. Tonight is about the potential for working class people to change the world, not in the far distance or in a place thousands of miles away, but somewhere very close and somewhere that's very much like Britain. And although it is by no means inevitable that the end result of it will be victory for our side or a transformation of French society, nonetheless, what we have seen over the last few weeks in France is extraordinary. The scale of it, to begin with, 3 times in the last month, around 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 million people have taken part in mass demonstrations, largely made up of workers, many of them on strike, many of them not on strike, fighting against pension reform pushed through by the neoliberal government of President Emmanuel Macron. At the centre of that movement is an indefinite strike on the railways, the SNCF, the main national rail firm, and the RATP, the French Parisian public transport service. Those strikes have been continuing indefinitely since the 5th of December. So that's a very, very long time. It's the longest rail strike in French history. Longer than the Great Strike of 1995 or the strike of 1986-1987, both of which were very, very serious strikes. It doesn't mean that everyone in the railways is on strike. It doesn't exist like that. France actually has a much lower level of formal trade union membership than Britain does. But nonetheless, something like 40%, 50%, 60% of the drivers and signallers, the crucial people in any rail service, are on strike on any particular day since the 5th of December. And some days it's much higher than that. On the metro, the Parisian equivalent of the tube, most of the time only 1 or 2 of 14 lines are running with a normal service. The only 2 that really run are the 2 that are run without workers. They're automated tube lines. A lesson to all tube workers: don't ever allow them to put in automated services. But it's not just those who've been on strike. We've also seen large numbers of teachers on strike. Oh, a teacher joins us just at the right time. Large number of teachers on strikes. Health workers who've been on and off strike for quite a long time, actually, in France. Firefighters. Postal workers, refuse workers, council workers, civil service workers, refinery workers, electricity generation workers, and many more, some that you wouldn't normally think about, like the ballet dancers at the Paris Opera, for example, who are, sort of iconic of the movement, because clearly when they're on a picket line and dancing Swan Lake, that looks a bit different to refinery workers or something of that sort. Refinery workers may be important in terms of capitalist development, but nonetheless it's quite impressive to have the ballet dancers of the Paris Opera on it. And this movement has continued despite the fact that the government has said it makes some concessions. So I'll come on to it later, but the government has said quite recently, Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, said that they would drop, at least temporarily, the attempt to increase the pension age, which normally you'd think would be enough to stop such a movement. Not at all. People rejected it because there were other elements of the package which they were against. The only people who accepted it were the cops. Philippe made very quickly to say, oh, by the way, when we're putting up the pension age, we don't mean you. Not the people who are, clubbing the strikers and have clubbed the yellow vests for over a year. We don't mean you. You can still retire as early as you like. So the only people who have accepted the changes have been the cops. And some of the union leaders, it needs to be said, but I'll come back to that. It's an extraordinary movement. Mass strikes since the 5th of December, 3 times over 1 million people on the streets of demonstrations, and an extraordinary sense of resistance, conviviality, to use a French word, a sense of unity against Macron. And one of the things that we should really take as very hopeful from this is that it's coming after a presidential election in 2017, which was a complete disaster for the left. You know, a bigger disaster than the 12th of December was for us. Let's be clear about that. The most popular left candidate at the 2017 elections, Jean-Luc Mélenchon of France Insoumise, took 20% of the vote. The equivalent of the Labour Party came fifth with 6% of the vote. The runoff was between Macron, the darling of the neoliberals across Europe, and Marine Le Pen of the Front National, the fascist organisation. That was who got through to the final round, Macron or the fascist. That's a terrible situation for the left, to be so marginalised in electoral competition. But yet, that doesn't define what's happening in French society a few years later. Within 18 months, we saw the emergence of the Lfs Movement, the Gilets jaunes, in France. A movement that certainly at its start was highly contradictory, lots of contested ideas inside it, but which produced the most extraordinary resistance and has faced terrific police repression. I mean, the amount of tear gas used is far greater than used in Hong Kong. I mean, the repression of the Hong Kong protests has been appalling. But the amount used in France is very, very much greater. Dozens of people have lost an eye by the firing of flashball grenades, as they're called, a form of rubber bullets that are used against demonstrators. I think 6 people now have had a hand torn off by the flashball grenades, knocking their hand off. Numbers of people have died during the Yellow Vest protests. Wholly missed, actually, by the vast majority of mainstream accounts of these things, which you wouldn't know that this has been happening in France. And then, on the back of this, you have this period of huge mass strikes that are going on and mass demonstrations. Now, we need to understand why this is, because within it, it's not just an ordinary trade union dispute. You also see 2 really important factors. Number one, it's driven very much by rank and file involvement. Not just watching the union leaders and seeing what they're doing, but disciplining the union leaders and on some occasions moving outside what the trade union leaders want to do. You see in some workplaces, not all, don't let me say that this is happening everywhere, but in some places you can see that there are regular, daily assemblies of strikers to decide whether to continue the strike and how to raise the combativity of the movements. Let me just give you a couple of examples. At Paris's Gare du Nord station, for example, here's one account of it. In front of 150 strikers and the flags of the 4 unions that operate in the workplace, all the speakers insisted that they rejected any division. The same slogan was on everyone's lips. No negotiation with the government. Renewal of the strike movement. There was a near unanimous vote for this. Now you see, it's first of all interesting that this isn't a union meeting. This is a meeting of all the 4 different unions, Gare du Nord. And in addition, I know at that assembly there were people who were not members of the unions as well. And they elect a strike committee, which goes beyond the normal bounds. So, you know, I suppose it would be like at Lambeth Council if you had a single meeting of Unison, the GMB, Unite, whoever else was there, and even people not in the union, who said, we're running our strike, we're all out together, we're continuing our strike, but we're not listening to the normal structures of the trade union to do this, we're creating our own structures. A far more radical sense about it. Here's another example. An assembly of 200 teachers in the city of Tours voted to welcome the fact the strikes are continuing, to encourage other groups to join extended strikes and to demonstrate alongside the Yellow Vests. On the 12th of December, the port of Le Havre and its huge industrial zone were completely blocked after a call by the union's coordinating body and the city's General Assembly of Workers. Now, these are important developments. They are people seizing control of the strike movement, and they're not looking upwards, they're looking at what they can do themselves and to other groups of workers who are on strike alongside them. This is a very, very important development of workers' democracy at the base. And then you see important political developments. So, for example, one of the groups on strike has been power workers, electricity generation workers, and people who operate the power plants. They have politically targeted particular sections of the bosses and the state and helped ordinary people with their power bills. So, again, a couple of inspiring examples. EDF power strikers in Bordeaux have cut off for long periods firms such as Lidl and IKEA, the Logistics Centre for Cdiscount, France's biggest e-commerce website, and the city's bus depot. Meanwhile, while they were cutting off these big companies, they transferred 80,000 people to off-peak rates for their power bills, which meant that their bills were cut by a huge amount. Bastien, a CGT union member, EDF, says, "We take the kilowatts of the rich and give them to the poor." That's a fantastic quotation about the idea that we will decide who has the power and who doesn't. In another one of the power stations over Christmas, they closed down Amazon's big depot on the outskirts of Paris. And at the same time, they said, we are going to stop these new meters they've installed that cut off power to people who haven't paid their bills over the past, a bit like those ones that you have to use in Britain where you put a key into it, which you have to pay more and so on. There will be no candlelit Christmas for the poor, was the slogan that they used. And you can see how incredibly political it is that you have mass movements of strikers and demonstrators, you have elements of democracy at the base of the unions, and then you have this strength of political decisions being made by strikers. Now, it's not a Soviet, it's not a workers' council, but nonetheless you can see how workers can go beyond normal trade unionism around when strikes move to a higher level. Right. Why is it happening now? Why now? I think we have to understand a long period here. From the 1990s, a number of people have auditioned in France to be the France Margaret Thatcher. They saw what happened with the neoliberalism in the 1980s, and at various points they have said France needs the same thing. We need to sweep away workers' rights, we need to reduce pensions entitlements, we need to make French capitalism much, much more competitive, and we will do that by breaking trade union power and beating down workers' living standards. The first real attempt to do this was in 1995, a man called Alain Juppé, who attacked pensions and was met by a huge wave of strikes. In some ways, I want to say it's different later on, in some ways similar to that which is happening now. Rail workers, postal workers, many other workers, allied to students as well. A very big movement. And again, you see in 1995 the formation of local committees, of committees beginning to liaise one with another and coordinate action and so on. Very big demonstrations. What was seen as very big demonstrations, I can remember writing about, there was a demonstration of 800,000 people together across France during the 1995 dispute. Actually, they're much bigger now, the demonstrations, than they were in 1995. But it was the first real attempt, and I haven't got time to go through all the details of it, I can if people want me to, but Juppé was defeated. I mean, Juppé had to retreat. He started making concessions, then he had to make more concessions, and then eventually entirely retreated over the changes to pensions which he had wanted to make. So Juppé was the first French Margaret Thatcher, but he was not the last. A number of others have attempted to be. Nicolas Sarkozy, who you may remember was president a few years ago, he once gave an interview to the newspaper Le Figaro in 2008, in which he said, the president predicted to one of his advisors, one day they'll say I made as many reforms as Margaret Thatcher. But he didn't. He didn't because his attempts to break the power of the unions and to force through attacks on welfare were defeated. Not wholly defeated. I don't want to suggest that all of this is a wonderful tale of the working class winning. It's certainly not true. François Fillon was another who attempted to see him, a big admirer of Margaret Thatcher. Again, attempted to push this through. Again, workers' living standards were reduced in some cases, but there wasn't the fundamental breakthrough which the ruling class wanted. Macron is the latest embodiment of this, and he has been more serious than any of the ones that I've spoken to before. He has not bothered with what you might call the intervening layers. He is contemptuous of the trade union leaderships. He has been contemptuous of any idea that what he's really going to do is to bring this in by a calm negotiation. No, he's going to confront the working class movement. And he has had some success. In 2018, he essentially won the strike on the railways, which was about pension reform. He has forced two layers of trade union reform, weakening trade union rights. He has forced through attacks upon benefits. He has weakened workplace rights for people. I don't want to suggest that there have been successes all the way, but Macron is now coming up, the big one. The big one is to take on and win over what is seen as one of the totemic questions of workers in France, which is about the question of pensions. At the moment, there are lots of different schemes, but sizable numbers of workers can retire at the age of 62. This is one of the reasons why people live longer in France than they do in Britain, because they retire early and they have a better pension system than we do here. Some workers can retire earlier than that. About 1 million workers, miners, rail workers, public underground workers and so on, can retire earlier than 62 because they have tough jobs or because they've won better conditions. The rail workers' pension scheme was essentially won at the end of the Second World War because of the role of the resistance and so on. And it's a very important one. Bizarrely, the pension scheme at the Paris Opera amongst ballet dancers was first introduced in the 17th century and has been defended ever since by ballet dancers. Because you can't dance when you're 60 in the same way as you can when you were 25 or something. It's a huge thing. What does Macron want to do? He wants to move the pension age from 62 to 64, the pivotal age as it's called. It doesn't mean that everyone would retire at 64. Lots of people would still have to work till they were 65 or 66 or 67 to get a decent pension. He wants to bring in what's called a point system, that you accrue points during your working life, and then the government says the point is worth this much when you retire. The only trouble is they can change it. So you might think your pension is going to be 200 quid a week, and then you might decide the government's changed it. Actually, it's only worth £150 now. But it would be up to the government to decide this based upon longevity and what it thinks about the economic situation. Macron wants to do away with all the special schemes for rail workers and underground workers and all those sorts of people. And he also wants to change the basis on which you work out what your pension is. At the moment, it's based upon essentially the highest paid years of your working life. Macron wants to change it so it's an average across the whole of your working life, which, because lots of people now are facing years or decades or the whole of their working life where they're in and out of work or they're paid very, very low wages for a period, it would mean they're paid less. So it's a classic scheme that's been introduced across the whole of Europe and many other parts of the world, where you work longer and get less at the end of it. And this huge assault is what has triggered the response by people in France. And Macron is determined not to step back from it. Not to step back from it. He can't afford to be seen to have lost. If he loses, thank you, all the other neoliberal assaults that he wants to push through are endangered because he will be seen to have been broken. Now, that's interesting. We can understand what the ruling class are attempting to do. A long-term project to break the power of the working class in order to force through neoliberalism much deeper than it has done so far. What about our side? How has our side risen to this level of struggle? It's not something special about the French that they've done this. How do we understand it? First of all, a long period of stagnation of living standards, a sense of bitterness about rampant inequality. France is an extremely unequal society. There's a small elite at the top who are fantastically wealthy, and most people have seen their living standards since the financial crisis held down or falling. So a sense of bitterness about that. But that's not enough on its own. I think the Lfs movement can't be in any way discounted as an important element, because what the Lfs movement showed was that it was possible to stand up and fight. It was possible to resist. And in addition, it went outside the normal boundaries of resistance. People in France speak about the yellow vestification of the trade union movement. That people got this sense that you don't have to wait for the union leaders to tell you to do things. And you don't have to think in the rigid parameters of who's in my union or who's not in my union, or are they in the same industry as me. You can go beyond that. You can begin to raise these questions in a much broader way. And it's interesting, the slogans. You see, one of the slogans that emerged in the Yellow Vest movement after a period of political hiatus and discussion and confrontation and argument was this slogan about end of the week, end of the world, by which they meant we are worried about whether our end of the month, end of the world, not end of the week, whether our wages will stretch to the end of the month. That's one thing we're worried about. We're also worried about the end of the world, because the movement began about the price of petrol. So everyone said, "Oh, these are people who aren't concerned about climate change and so on." It very quickly moved to where these people were as concerned about climate change as anybody else was, and this slogan encapsulated it. The combination of a very clear class demand: will our wages and benefits and so on, our pensions, last to the end of the month? And then there's the question of the end of the world, and one of the slogan, "we want to live, not just exist," is another one that's a Yellow Vest slogan, which has been taken up in the pension movement as well. The question of survival is a word you hear in lots of the online forums about the pension strikes. Survival, which is both about, will my pension be enough? Will I survive when I stop work? Also, what's happening to the world? Are we going to survive in this world? And it's very interesting that demonstrations around pensions have also taken on Yellow Vests, who demonstrate alongside the strikers. Environmental groups at various points have joined the demonstrations. Feminist groups, youth, students, school students, and so on, and many other protesters in French society. In other words, it's become a lightning rod for all the different forms of anger and resistance inside France, just as in some ways the Yellow Vests did as well. And this combination of the Yellow Vest movement and the power of the working class is, I think, why it's so exciting, why it's so radical, and why it scares the ruling class in a profound way. Right, now what's the politics of it? Number one, don't think that the trade union leaders aren't trying to do just what Len McCluskey or Tim Roach or Dave Prentice would be trying to do here. In other words, they urge it on at various points, but they're also looking for a deal. So one of the biggest union federations, the CFDT, has always been iffy about supporting the movement at all. It sees itself as a social partner which is prepared to discuss with Macron and come to a deal at the end of it. UNSA, the autonomous union so-called, was one of those who tried to stop the rail strikes over Christmas. Tried very, very hard. There should be a truce because this is an important time for our families and all the rest of it, and people need to travel off to see their parents and so on. Let's stop it all over Christmas. Fortunately, there was immense resistance from the rank and file of their own union, who said, no, we're not stopping. 14 regions of the rail workers of UNSA said that they would not end the strikes, and that was stopped. But they're trying to do it. Let's be clear about that. If there wasn't that pressure from below, there would be an attempt to do that. The political parties on the left have been ambivalent, largely, about it. Slow to support, to really get behind. The far right, Marine Le Pen has at various points attempted to say, not that I support the strikes, that would be a dangerous thing for Le Pen to say, but to say there's a case here. I don't like Macron because she hopes to be running against Macron in the next presidential election. So she tries to pose as the friend of the movement from below. Except it's now got beyond too far. So yesterday, Le Pen made a speech in which she said, we've got good reason to hate the CGT union, and Martinez, Philippe Martinez, the leader of the CGT union. She said, we've got good reason to hate these people because suddenly the strikes are going too far for her and her right-wing racist base. So there's this big political gap which has been created. The problem is it doesn't automatically lead over to the formation of revolutionary socialists, of a new political party, a new sense of a socialist movement, and so on. So there's the argument inside the movement is, number one, the strikes need to be generalised. We need a general strike. We don't just need partial strikes. Everybody needs to get out. We need to ratchet up the pressure on Macron. We can win, but it requires an indefinite general strike in order to make sure we beat the other side. That's one argument. The other argument is about politics. That we need something that encapsulates this sense of resistance and unity across the working class, which you see glimpses of both in the strikes, the rank and file control, and of what the yellow vests prefigured before it. And that's what revolutionary organisation is about. And it's also about arguing within the movement against racism, against sexism, against division, to bring together the issues of the strikes and the issues of climate change, to go beyond simply the question of pensions, to go to the question of what sort of society we want to live in and how we are going to achieve it through workers' power and through resistance. That's why what's happening is important. It's both a demonstration of the potential for the working class and an underlining of the need for political organisation and revolutionary organisation. I'll finish with one quote from our friends of Autonomie de Classe, which are co-thinkers of ours in France who are part of the MPA party, who write this last week. The strike is beautiful. Beautiful as ministers, depressed deputies and editors who stammer and stutter before the force of the movement. Macron's world is a human relations department surrounded by riot police. It is this world that we must destroy to gain what we want. Everything. Now, it's a slightly poetic rendition of it, and beautiful for that. But I think it's also is to remind us both the potential for the working class to change the world, but also the need for our politics at the centre of it. Thank you.